Hello there, and welcome to this video explaining some tips and tricks for how to sing responsorial psalms in church. My name is James Bibey and I am the Director of Music at the Catholic Chaplaincy at Fisher House in Cambridge. I'm also a tenor and choral scholar at Downing College Choir in Cambridge, and I also play the organ at my home parish at St Joseph's in Cardiff. So I think, having started singing psalms when I was 8 years old, I have a fair amount of experience with responsorial psalms from a variety of backgrounds. I started off with a music group where the main accompaniment would be guitar and perhaps some keyboard. And I'm now in a setting where I sing primarily with organ accompaniment. I've also sung Anglican chant psalms, which are quite different to responsorial psalms, so I have this point of comparison, so I can give you some advice on that. The psalms are the most important thing to sing at Mass, aside from perhaps the Gospel acclamation. Psalms are one of the few parts of the liturgy where we know that historically that these were sung. When the psalms were written down, they were sung pieces of music. There's even some scholarship to suggest that we retain some of the records of the exact music that was sung, not written in modern Western notation, but certainly translatable to some of the early chants that entered into church usage both in the West and in the East. The singing of the psalms is very important at church, and yet so often at a Sunday Mass, when everything else is being sung, we don't hear the psalms sung. Why is that? Sometimes it's because of a lack of musicians, people who are not confident singers. Sometimes it's because of a misunderstanding of how a psalm needs to work. A lot of times people assume that a psalm will need, number one, need accompaniment, which is not always true. Many psalms can be sung independently. Or it's an assumption that perhaps psalms need a specific type of accompaniment, organ, piano, etc. And in fact, that's also not true, and there are plenty of psalms written for guitars and other instruments which might be more readily accessible to you in your parish. And I think sometimes there's some fear or reluctance from singers. Certainly in the UK, a lot of people are unfortunately quite embarrassed by their voices when they really shouldn't be. Psalm singing develops a lot of skills for you. One can become a much more confident singer. I've only got to where I am today really because I started singing in front of other people at quite an early stage, and the psalms are a really good gateway into singing like that. So I can only encourage you to give it a go. I'm going to be using an example psalm today from my own Psalter, the Fisher Psalter, which can be found online. And specifically, I'm going to be singing "The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want," which is sung on a number of Sundays. In particular, this one is from Sacred Heart Sunday or Sacred Heart Feast in the year C. So how does a responsorial psalm work? The first thing to say is a responsorial psalm has a congregational response. This is not something that a choir or a cantor sings by themselves. It's something where the cantor will announce the psalm, and then the congregation will repeat. And then the cantor will sing a verse, and then the congregation repeats, and back and forth and back and forth. So that's how it works. The other thing to say is that in the Catholic tradition, the verses are not metrical. So there are lots of metrical psalms. In fact, "The Lord is my shepherd" is very famous for having a metrical setting that's often used as a hymn in many parishes to the tune Crimond. But in the Anglican tradition, one would see a lot of metrical psalms. One would also see a lot of psalms just for choir. But the Catholic tradition is of non-metrical psalming. And what this means is that when one gets to the verses, one is not singing to a strict meter. One can sing the text as one thinks it should be. You've got to imagine yourself as if you're just reading without singing, and then add the music on top of that, and there shouldn't be any significant change in the rate at which you're saying things. An example of this. "The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where he gives me repose. So you see how I sang that almost as if I was reading it, with that same what we call prosody, that sort of lack of monotony, the emphasis on the words. Emphasis can be provided in a number of ways, not just by volume as many people think, but also by the length of the words, especially when you don't have to stick to a strict tempo. Let me compare that to a style of singing which is a bit more monotonous, and one hears this style in some psalm traditions, particularly with the Zamani chant in the Orthodox tradition, but one doesn't usually hear this style in English music or in psalms for the Catholic Church, and you'll immediately hear the difference. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where he gives me repose. One of the further things you need to think about as a cantor is that you're in charge. If you're with other instrumentalists or accompanists, then it's really important that you try and give them some direction as to how the psalm should work. If you're trying out a psalm and there's already an established musical tradition at your parish, perhaps a director of music, it can feel quite intimidating to come in and say, I want to do it like this. But the most important thing is that you assert, at least when you're singing the verses, the tempo, the pace that you want to sing. And there will be various different tempos that appeal to people. Let me give an example. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where he gives me repose. Alternatively, some people might like to sing a little bit faster. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where he gives me repose. The important thing is to give some direction. That's easy enough for me, accompanying myself. But if you're in a position where you have a different accompanist, then you're going to have to give some direction. And the best way I would recommend of doing this is to use your body language for this. Don't use your hand signals, use your body language for this. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where he gives me repose. And so just with a simple nod, you can mimic the downbeats which you want to set. And that can make a big difference for your accompanist. Now, the final thing is to think about your vocal technique. Singing in a church can be quite different to singing in any other space. It's often quite large. If you're a cantor and you're singing by yourself, it can be quite intimidating. You might be up against some very loud instruments, a very loud organ, very loud guitars. The first thing to do is to not strain your voice. It's very easy, if you are starting psalming, to get into a position where you overexert yourself because you're trying to match the volume that you think you need. That can lead to long-term damage to your voice. It's really important to avoid laryngitis caused by oversinging. That's a very serious point, I think. So what are the alternatives to this? Well, the first thing is really think about how quiet the accompaniment can be. Can the organ only play one stop, for example? Or if you have multiple guitarists, maybe only one of the guitarists plays during the accompaniment for the verses. You can try out lots of different things. The other thing to say is there really shouldn't be any melody instruments playing during the verses. You need to have the freedom to assert the text without any distraction to your melody. The other thing then to think about is the long-term solution, which is how do you grow your voice without straining? There are lots of professional singers who can sing incredibly loudly. How do they do it? Well, the first thing to do is to think about your breathing. the more you practice breathing, the better you get at it. And there are some who say that singing really is breathing with style, and I tend to agree with that point on the whole. People often breathe suboptimally. The first thing to think about is how deeply can you breathe? A way that I often try to do this is try and breathe out as much air as you can, and then breathe in through an open mouth. And you'll find that your diaphragm is the thing that's doing all the work. You shouldn't be using your shoulders. The Lord is my shepherd. Doesn't work. And it's going to make the sound quite irregular because the air pressure is quite irregular. You're trying to squeeze out as much air as you can, and it's not going to work well for you. What you should instead try and do is build diaphragmatic strength. And then as you develop your vocal technique more, you can think about the muscles that support the diaphragm. So the stuff that's pushing the diaphragm back up is actually all the squidgy bits in your abdomen. So you can squeeze your abdomen a little bit. You don't want there to be too much tension across your body on the whole, but actually engaging those abdominal muscles, both on the front and on the back, can really help. You can try exercises such as laughing, ha ha ha, ha 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 ha, ha ha ha, ha ha ha. And if you can really get that breathing support, that will really help your vocal technique. Another thing that is really helpful is not to change the position of your body whilst you're singing. If you're making huge movements, that can be very damaging to the sound. So this presents a little bit of a dilemma because you want to direct your accompanist, you want to give a little bit of ebb and flow to it, a bit of direction, but at the same time, it would be a bad idea to go, don't want to do that. Instead, I would recommend, if you're giving that, make it almost that you're on your tiptoes a bit. Your whole body raises up and descends. And that way, you can provide that direction without changing the position of things here. Everything here stays quite still, and that's really helpful for you. The other thing to say is think about the key that the psalm is in. Every person has their own what we call tessitura. That is the range of notes that singer can sustain for the longest in terms of minutes or hours of singing, and which sound the best for that person. In general, a bass will have a low tessitura, or an alto will have a low tessitura. Tenors, sopranos have high tessituras. If you've got a good director or a good singer in your church, try and explore with them where your tessitura lies. And it can change over time, especially if you're young. If you're a teenager going into early adulthood, your tessitura will change enormously. So try and then match psalms to that. In the Fisher Psalter, for example, all of the psalms are really written for a baritone or a mezzo-soprano, and that means they should be singable by most people. But that's not to say that a very high soprano or a very low bass wouldn't struggle with some of the psalms. And if you have that possibility, you can try and transpose psalms. This is particularly easy if you've got guitar accompaniment. It's a little bit more difficult if you've got keyboard accompaniment, where you might actually have to go away and write out the entire psalm separately rather than just changing the capo. But you should consider all these options. If the psalm is in your tessitura, your voice will naturally be louder. And then the other thing to think about is vowel sounds. Some people sing and they barely open their mouth at all. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Compared to, the Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. The more you open your mouth, the more sound comes out. Of course, that can mean that the vowels end up being changed. The reason we don't naturally do this when we sing is because when we speak, the mouth barely moves at all. But when we sing, we need to move the mouth more. Some exercises that people find helpful for this are exercises that relax these jaw muscles to the side. You can massage them if you want. Some people try an exercise where they just try and move the jaw. Exercise. Some people call it chewing the gum. Those types of exercises can really help. Or you can try exercises where you do tongue twisters. You'll see a lot of choirs use tongue twisters. The tip of the tongue is touching the teeth, etc. These types of exercises can be really helpful to you. The other thing to think about is how one develops sound when one has it. So an exercise that's often helpful for working out vowel position is an exercise where you try out different vowels. Like so. So you can try out all the vowels and you can see the position changes. In general, vowels which are placed a little bit further back in the mouth, perhaps a bit on the palate, you feel the areas on the palate, are much better than ah. You almost have to become quite English to sing some of this music. You know, ah is a very horrendous vowel to sing on high notes, for example. Ah is a lot better. You'll notice this a lot. Some people call it softening the vowels, and that's what they mean on the whole, is that the vowel becomes a little bit more round as you see it in the person's mouth. Ah rather than ah. These vowel changes can really help you. My only advice is to just play around with them. Some of them will work, some of them won't, but you've got to try these out. I hope that this has all been helpful for you. Obviously, if you're going to be singing psalms regularly and you really want support with growing your voice, it's important to get singing lessons if you can. Even being in a choir and regularly singing will really help your voice as well. And it's important to keep working on this. Even the professionals, semi-professionals are constantly working on these things and trying out new things for new pieces of music. Psalms in general require a sort of fairly consistent set of parameters. You sing them in a very similar way each week. So actually learning to sing psalms is not as big a hurdle as joining a choir that sings lots of different types of music. So again, don't be afraid. Even if you think, well, that's quite a lot to learn, try out one little thing each week and you'll be surprised by how fast you progress. I hope this is helpful for you with psalming in the parish. Remember that the psalm is one of the most important things to be sung, so please do encourage people to sing the psalm in your parish. Thank you.